Hello and welcome to the third lecture in the Intro to Python series. In this lecture, we will be going over control flow in Python and some of the available control flow tools. Control flow basically refers to the order in which instructions are executed by the Python interpreter. So if you take a look at the example here, Python will execute each line one after the other sequentially. So first, it will initialize the value of x as 10, then it will double the value of x to 20, and then finally it will print the value of x. It might be helpful to visualize this in terms of flowchart as shown here, where after executing the code in each block, Python will move on to the next block as indicated by the arrow until it reaches the end. So by default, the Python interpreter will execute each line of code one after the other sequentially. But what if you want Python to execute different lines based on some condition? Let's take a look at an example. Consider the case where you are taking an input from a user. So you could do this, for example, by using the input method. So when you run this, it will ask you to enter a number. So you could enter a number like 10, and that number will be saved into x. So for example, if you print x, it will show the value 10. So the input method by default will return a string. And if you want to convert it to an integer, you can call an int function around the input. If you run this, it will still be the same. It will ask you to enter a number. You can enter something like 10, and if you print the value of x, you will get 10. Now, let's say we want to print if the number is odd or even. So let's say if the number is odd, you want to print something like x is odd. But you only want to execute this if x is odd. And if x is even, then you want to print x is even. And this line should only be executed if x is even. Let's take a look at how this might show up in terms of a flowchart. So we have the flowchart for this corresponding code that we want to write. So here we have the first block where you have x equal to int, input, enter a number. Now here you have a condition that you want to check. If x is odd, then you want Python to execute this line of code, which is print x is odd. And if x is even, which means that x is not odd, then you want Python to print that x is even. So you want some way for Python to jump from this line to this line if x is odd, and from this line to this line if x is even. Now control flow tools are something that will help you achieve something like this in Python. So with control flow tools, you can execute certain blocks of code conditionally, or you can even repeat certain blocks of code over and over again. In Python, there are if statements that let you execute certain blocks of code based on some condition. So let's go back to our earlier example of printing if a number is odd or even. So here we'll add some code to first get the number from the user. And then in Python, you can specify a condition. So you say if x is odd, which you can find out by using the modulo operator. So if you divide a number with 2, and if the remainder is 1, then that means the result is odd. So if you have x modulo 2 equals 1, then print that x is odd. Else, which means x modulo 2 is not 1, then you can print that x is even. So if you run this code, let's just say I enter 10, then it will print x is even. So if I run this again, and this time if I put an odd number, then it will print x equals odd. Let's take a look at what's happening here. So first you have the statement where you take an input from the user. After that, you have the if statement. Now the if statement will check a condition. The condition has to be either true or false. So for example, here we're checking x modulo 2 equals 1. Let's see what this returns. So for example, let's just say we have x equals 10. And x modulo 2, in this case, will be 0. So if you do x modulo 2 equals 0, and let's try to print it. And then you will see that it will print true, which is true, because x modulo 2 will be 0 because x is even. But if you do x modulo 2 equals 1, then this will return false. So the if statement will check if the condition here is true or false. If it is true, then it will execute this line of code. If it is false, then it will execute the line of code that is inside the else block. So which is what is happening over here. So when we run this code, and when we say put an even number, it will go in here, it will check if x modulo 2, which is 10 modulo 2 is 1, which is not the case, which means it's false. and then it will go to this line over here and it will print x equals even. Python also has an else if, so you can do more than just one condition. So let's do another case where we are taking an input from a user and you want to check if the input number is positive, negative, or 0. So now we have 3 conditions to check. So you will start by checking first if x equals 0, then you print x is 0. Else if, so Python has something called an elif, which is short for else if. This lets you check another condition. So if you check elif x greater than 0, then that means x is positive. And then you do another else if x is less than 0, then you print x is negative. Now if you run this code, let's say I input again 100, it will print x is positive. If I run this again and I say minus 10, it will print x is negative. And if I run this again one more time, and this time if I press 0, it will give you x equals 0. Now the thing to note here is that it's not necessary to have an else at the end. So in this case, you had one if and 2 else if. And also you can have as many else if as you want. So here we have 2, and in this case over here we don't have any at all. So to conclude, the if statement lets you choose which block of code to execute. Now consider the case where you want to execute a block of code multiple times. This is where the while statement comes in. So let's add a block of code here and we'll use if and while and we'll see how it differs. So let's just say you have some number n equals 1 and then you have a condition. If n is less than 5, then you print that n is less than 5. And then let's say you increment n to be n equals n plus 1, and then finally you do something like print done. Right. So if you look at this code, you first have the initialization for n equals 1, and then it has an if condition which checks if n is less than 5, which in this case is true, and then it will print n followed by the string is less than 5. So here the value of n is 1, and it will print n less than 5. Then it will increment n to be n plus 1, and then finally we have the print statement which says done. Now something to note here is that in Python, the block of code that is inside the if is based on indentation. So here you have some space, which means all of this code is inside the if statement, and anything that's not intended is outside. Now let's take the same code, copy paste it. Now let's try removing the if and replacing it with a while. Now let's run this code. And now you'll see that there are many more lines here than there are in the if statement or the if code block. So what exactly is happening here? So here you have the initialization of n equals 1, and then the while statement is similar to the if, but it runs a piece of code repeatedly until this condition is satisfied. So the if condition runs this code once if this condition is satisfied. The while statement, on the other hand, will keep running this code continuously as long as this condition is satisfied. So let's take a look. So you have n equals 1, then 1 is less than 5, so that's good. Then it will print 1 is less than 5. That's what you get here. Then it will increment n to be 2. So n, you have n equals n plus 1, so now the value of n is 2. So here you have a check for 2 is less than 5. This is true. Then it will print 2 is less than 5, which is what you have here. Now it will increment n to be 3. Now you have the condition 3 is less than 5, which is also true. And then it will print 3 is less than 5, which you have here. And then it will go back. Now you have 4 is less than 5, which is also true. And then you have the statement 4 is less than 5. And then finally it will increment to the value 5, and then it will check if 5 is less than 5. This is false. That means it will exit from this block of code, and then it will reach here, and then it will see the print statement, and then it will do print done. So to sum up, the while statement will repeatedly execute a block of code as long as the given condition over here is satisfied. That's it for this chapter. See you in the next lesson.